Hello readers by eyes and by ears, this is Mighty Chan and welcome back to my YouTube channel. Today we are continuing with the reading of Stars of Chaos Volume 3, also known as Chapelang by Priest, and unfortunately we're only covering 2 chapters, 87 and 88, because I have a lot of school work and regular work this week, and so I could only get these 2 chapters today instead of the last 4, but you'll get the last 2 very shortly after this. Enjoy! Chapter 87, Scholar. Before joining this mission, Commissioner Xu had been much like the rest of Great Liang. He held an absolute, irrational faith in the Marquis of Order and the Black Iron Battalion he represented. As if, were one in the company of Gu Yun, they could walk unscathed into a dragon's nest or tiger's den. Even if the sky collapsed, he would be there to hold it up. By this point, Xu Ling's faith had crumbled utterly. Assistant Supervisory Commissioner Xu's pretty face was ashen. Clinging to his last wisp of hope, he asked, "Marshal, was crossing the river also part of your plan?" "Of course not." Guyuan looked at him in bewilderment and sighed. "I told Master Feng Han we wouldn't be able to rely on this thing. Blackhawks fly so quickly because they rely on manual operation in the air. This giant hunk of metal does well enough in mild weather, but gives up as soon as it encounters a little wind and rain. Taking it onto the battlefield would be the same as delivering our heads to the enemy on a silver platter. And see, it broke down just as I thought." Guchun turned from puking his guts out, face blotchy with tears, and said, "This lower official will definitely give Master Feng Han a full accounting once we return." Xu Ling's stomach was twisting itself into knots in fright. He couldn't be as optimistic as Scholar Ge. He feared he might never return. At least there was one individual who could talk like a reasonable person here. Chang'eng turned and gave his assistant envoy a smile. "Don't listen to him. He's just trying to scare you. This is an open plain without a single tent in sight, which means we're nowhere near the enemy vanguard. It's also a stormy night, and the sound of the explosion will have blended into the thunder. The Marshal has a plan. We won't attract a large number of enemy troops. At most, an alert patrol might come investigate." Guyuan smirked. Xu Ling looked at Prince Yan with tears in his eyes. Despite the treacherous situation they were in, at least he could prostrate himself before Prince Yan in admiration of his bravery and composure in the face of danger. "Your Highness, your wisdom is profound," he said in full sincerity. "What wisdom?" Chang'eng waved him off. "He's tricked me every which way since my youth. I've had plenty of experience." Somehow, Xu Ling felt there was an unusual intimacy in the way Prince Yan spoke of Gu Yun. Lying in wait in the middle of nowhere on a blustery night wasn't exactly the height of comfort, but fortunately, the Western Patrol arrived with alacrity. Before long, a group of soldiers appeared, cursing in their foreign language. The ground shivered with hoofbeats, and Guyuan's mischievous smile slipped into a frown. "Odd," he said quietly. Xu Ling had learned to startle at Guyuan's every move. "Marshal Gu, what's odd?" "The newcomers have 3, 4, 5. Why are they so few?" Prince Yan lowered his voice. "Are the Westerners playing children's games with their patrols?" "I don't know." Guyuan shook his head. "Let's take them down first. Does anyone speak their foreign gibberish?" The group turned as one to Prince Yan. Chang'eng stared at 24 guards gazing at him like baby birds waiting to be fed and said, "Why is everyone looking at me?" Guchun was shocked. "Your Highness, you don't speak their language either?" Chang'eng was mystified. "I do know some Suzhou vernacular, but since when have I ever known any foreign languages?" Perhaps it was because they found his conduct mysterious, his considerations thorough, or because they found him in general a capable person. But after the past year or so, everyone seemed to think that no matter the occasion, Prince Yan would know something of everything and always have a ready solution. Assistant Envoy Xu suddenly spoke up. "This lower official actually understands a bit." Everyone who had been staring at Prince Yan swiveled their heads to look at him. Prince Yan among them. Xu Ling coughed, self-consciously, but met their gazes. When His Highness and Marshal Gu defended the city gates and the officials followed His Majesty to stand beneath the ramparts, I was there too. The uselessness of scholars was impressed upon me then, but without knowledge of all six arts, I haven't the ability to ride or shoot or slay enemies on the battlefield. Thus, I resolved to learn some foreign languages. I thought, if we have to fight again, I can at least aid our generals by running errands and repeating messages. Then I won't have lived as a man in vain. His last words rang with determination, but for Assistant Envoy Xu, their party was composed entirely of Jianghu veterans and black crows, crafty and cunning. They moved like the wind on foot and were well accustomed to both taking lives and risking their own. Their journey had been peril after peril. Any normal person would probably have collapsed into a gibbering mess long ago. Weak scholar though he was, it was thanks to Commissioner Xu's dedication to service that he'd managed to grit his teeth and endure the journey thus far. Battered by wind and rain, this solitary scholar stood between heaven and earth. Guyuan rubbed his chin, too embarrassed to tease him further. In that case, we'll call on Commissioner Xu's services in a moment. The jovial light faded from Guyuan's eyes, replaced by a cold, steely gleam. Here they come. As he spoke, a Western patrol clad in light armor appeared before them. One man broke away from the group, did a few laps around the debris and the conflagration the rain had yet to extinguish, and garbled out some words. Xuling quietly translated. He said, with all this rain, a fire shouldn't start out of nowhere, but there are no outsiders in the area. What on earth happened? What did he mean, there are no outsiders in the area? Guyuan looked away as another Western soldier picked up a burnt piece of debris and turned it over in his hands. He suddenly sprang into the air and yowled something at his comrades. He said, "This bears the mark of Great Liang's military factories. Great Liang's spies have snuck in," Shuling explained hastily. "Marshal Gu, they're getting nervous. Have we been discovered?" Wood could be burned, but stone and iron could not. They must have recognized the mark of the Lingshu Institute. "Marshal Gu, these foreigners are likely going to sound the alarm and summon—" Guyuan put a hand on the wind slasher hanging at his waist. He cast a glance at Chang'eng, who had nonchalantly pulled out a small field scope and affixed it to the bridge of his nose. He wiped away the raindrops on the lens, then plucked experimentally at the string of his bow, tilting his head as if to discern whether it was waterlogged. Then, under Shuling's astonished gaze, he slowly drew back the string. With a swift wave of Guyuan's hand, 20-some guards of the Black Iron Battalion darted through the grass. A Western soldier unhooked a horn-shaped bugle from his waist and raised it to his lips to sound the alarm. He drew in a deep breath. An iron arrow sliced through the air. It buried itself unerringly in the man's left ear, and his head burst into a mess of red and white like a smashed watermelon, brain matter splattering his companions. In the next moment, several black silhouettes sprang into view and launched themselves at the blindsided Western soldiers, quick as lightning. Wind slashers streaked through the air in rapid succession, and several heads hit the ground in the blink of an eye, as quick as a chef's knife chopping through melons. Just one soldier was spared, a man who had yet to dismount his horse. The man raised a pair of trembling hands as he gaped in terror at the assassins who had materialized from the brush. Shuling sighed in relief and stiffly finished his previous sentence. "Summon their companions." Guyuan patted his shoulder. "They can't summon them anymore," he said earnestly. "Strip him down, tie him up, and bring him along. We shouldn't stay here much longer. Retreat!" Two black iron guards seized the Western soldier like a pair of thugs, stripped him of his armor, and searched him like they were peeling a clove of garlic, leaving the man naked as the day he was born. The man, who by this point resembled a half-crooked white-cut chicken, was bound and gagged into a trussed-up pig awaiting slaughter, then carried away. "I can see a village over there. Let's borrow a house for interrogation," Chang'eng said as he walked. "When war comes to these coastal regions, everyone capable of fleeing will flee. Only the elderly or frail invalids would have stayed behind. 9 out of every 10 homes should be empty. This is a good chance to probe the locals about the situation in the occupied regions. Commissioner Shu, you'll have to take the lead. My brothers in the Black Iron Battalion aren't good with words and walk around oozing bloodlust. Let's not have them scare our citizens. Yes, Your Highness? Xu Ling hurried to assent. He snuck a glance at Chang'e. Prince Yan had been thoroughly soaked by rain. A lock of hair hung loose at his temple, dripping wet. He was clearly picking his way through a desolate mire in the middle of nowhere, yet judging by his expression, he wasn't perturbed in the least. The bow that had made its debut in such spectacular fashion was once again in its place on his back. Chang'e happened to look up and catch Xu Ling's gaze. Commissioner Xu, is anything the matter? He asked good-naturedly. Several different expressions passed over Xu Ling's face. In the end, he swallowed the words that had risen to his lips and responded with no more than a polite shake of his head. They walked into a small village and found the place quiet as a ghost town. There were no sounds save the howling wind and rain and the crunch of their own footsteps. Thin, battered wooden doors hung ajar, and weeds grew half as high as the walls in every courtyard. Broken tiles and crumbling stone completed the tableau. In one doorway, a child's pea-green doodle hung, dripping with mud. The garment had long decayed into a tattered rag. The largest building in the village was the ancestral temple. Its courtyard was visible from a distance, a good place for outsiders to stay. Guchun produced a small stick the size of a fire starter. Twisting open the top revealed a faint light that shone on their surroundings. Tiles had come loose from the ceiling of the ancestral temple so that it poured outside and sprinkled within. What furnishings they saw were either toppled or broken, and only a few ratty bolts of cloth heaped in one corner, printed with characteristic Jiangnan patterns in simple and elegant hues, retained some hint of the place's former glory. Xu Ling scanned the interior and exterior of the ancestral temple, then said, "Looks like no one's here. Marshal Gu, could it be that all the locals have fled?" Guyuan frowned. He ordered a few guards to search the area, then bent to retrieve a piece of patterned cloth from the corner. "When I was last in Jiangnan, it was a warm spring with flowers in full bloom," Guyuan said, "surrounded by bouquets of flowers and piles of silks, caressed by the warm spring breeze. Even the rebels weren't in a hurry. They used merchant ships packed with condensed fragrance to smuggle violet gold." Before he could finish reminiscing, a guard charged inside. "Marshal, quick, behind the ancestral temple, in the rear courtyard, there's—" Guyuan raised an eyebrow. "What?" The guard forced out with difficulty. "The villagers." The little villages in Jiangnan were known to meander gracefully in their layout. A small river wound through this one, and the villagers' houses stood along its banks, the burbling stream caring naught for any limitation imposed by cardinal directions. But now, everything in sight was broken down, and half of the 4 stone tablets at the ancestral temple's gate reading loyalty, filial piety, integrity, and justice had shattered. Crushed stone had scattered into the surrounding thickets of weeds. As he walked, Xu Ling's foot collided with something. He looked down and nearly jumped into the air. It was a human bone. This... Prince Yan had taken the lead as the group stepped cautiously toward the rear courtyard. The ancestral tablets were strewn across the ground, and the toppled relics of gods and Buddhas were covered in a layer of dust. Atop the jet-black stone tiles of the courtyard lay countless decapitated corpses arrayed in orderly rows. Among them were men and women, old and young, the void-like eye sockets in their bleached-bone faces shrouded with cobwebs. Xu Ling sucked in an icy breath. His hand clenched around the doorframe. "This is a well-connected location," Chang'e said quietly after a long pause. "The open oceans and the inland canal are accessible from the north and south, while the official roads to the east and west stretch to the far ends of the nation. Travelers flow through in an endless stream. and most of the land here is flat plain. Any foreign power that occupies such a place will find it difficult to maintain tight control for long. It's too easy for people to sneak in. Their best option must have been a thorough cleansing. Shuling asked numbly, "What do you mean by a thorough cleansing?" "Send heavy armor infantry to raise the villages," Chang'e said. "Draw a circle on the map, herd everyone within it into one spot, clean them all up. Then dispatch troops to seize control of the entrances to the major official roads to see that no other living person enters. Something like thousands of Black Iron Battalion soldiers disguising themselves as itinerant merchants to sneak into the southwest will never happen here. Now I understand why there were so few soldiers on patrol. This place is a no man's land." As Chang'e spoke, he lashed out and kicked the western captive in his stomach. The captive's guts were nearly ejected from his throat with the force of this furious blow. Unable to scream around his gag, he rolled on the ground, whimpering like a pig being slaughtered. Guyuan took the little lamp from Guchan and shone it on the rain-soaked piece of wood, on which a line of words was carved with a fingernail. "Sir, what does it say?" Guyuan's throat bobbed. The tears of those left behind run dry amidst the dust kicked up by foreign hooves. Hooves is only half written. A body lay at the foot of the wooden post. It was mostly rotted, with white bones showing through in patches. A terrible sight. One index finger, picked clean by insects, stubbornly pointed toward the line of the poem, as if the person was continuing their silent interrogation. "Ghost fires dance through the land of fish and rice. Where is the imperial army with its generals? Where is the iron cavalry?" Only now, after an entire night in the rain, did the chill finally sink to the marrow of Guyuan's bones. "Jiangnan has fallen to enemy hands," at last bled from words on paper into a stark and horrifying reality. For several long minutes, the ancestral temple was silent as a tomb. Who knows how long they stood before Chang'e lightly nudged Guyuan. "Zushi, enough. The longer we tarry, the more can go wrong. We need to leave this place for now. Rendezvousing with Zhonglao is our top priority." Guyuan's fingertips were white with tension. When he rose, his vision flickered, and he stumbled before he found his footing. Startled, Chang'e grabbed his elbow. "What's wrong?" Guyuan's chest felt like it was being squeezed. A deep sense of fatigue he hadn't felt in years suddenly overwhelmed him, and for a helpless moment he felt feeble in a way he couldn't describe. After his injuries in that northwestern pass, no matter if he abstained from drink or reduced his dosage of medicine, he had been unable to forestall his body's decline. It was as if all the unseen debts he owed had come due at once. Today, he had no ready words to answer the interrogation of a corpse, and an uneasy weakness rose in his heart. "When will I be able to recover Jiangnan? Will I be too late?" These doubts and worries lingered but an instant before Guyuan squashed them back down. He returned to normal, at least as far as outsiders could tell. "It's nothing." Guyuan turned to look at Chang'e, then extricated his elbow from his grasp. As if nothing had happened, he said to Shuling, "Commissioner Shu, ask that white-haired monkey where their lair is, how many soldiers and sets of armor they've got, and where their armor is hidden. If he doesn't talk the first time, cut off one of his fingers, roast it, and feed him a tasty morsel." Supposedly, many of the Western soldiers were paid mercenaries and didn't hold to any such principle as courage in the face of death. Guyuan had numerous tricks to bamboozle and terrify the man, but he didn't have a chance to trot them out. The soldier confessed everything the instant one of the guards flashed his windslasher. It was as Chang'e had surmised. The Westerners had cleared large swaths of the plains along the riverbank of all inhabitants, leaving one sentry post to guard each area within the no man's land. Each sentry post housed a dozen or so soldiers, most of whom were cavalrymen. A portion of the main forces serve as the vanguard to face off against General Zhong and the rest of our forces, and another portion, Xu Ling pursed his lips, looking pained, and continued, went around looting and plundering, and forced captives to labor in the mines and work as slaves so they could ship their stolen goods back to their country and stop up the mouths of those who demand the Pope to step down. By now, the rain had ceased, and thick clouds parted to reveal a thin stream of moonlight. Around them was desolate wasteland as far as the eye could see. The scenes of prosperity, in which farming puppets busied themselves in the fields and farmers drank tea as they discussed matters of state, had long become things of the past. This lower official once thought that the refugees in Jiangbei were suffering unbelievable adversity, Xu Ling said quietly. But there they at least have straw huts to shelter from the rain and 2 bowls of thin porridge to claim per day. Talk won't change anything, Chang'an cut in. Let's go. Have that western dog lead the way to their sentry post. 2 Black Iron Battalion guards grabbed the western soldier on each side. Your Highness Prince Yan. Xu Ling took a few quick strides, calling after Chang'an. When will we be able to face these western dogs in battle? Chang'an didn't pause in his steps nor turn his head. If we can successfully settle the refugees in Jiangbei, and if the heavens are merciful and do not strike us with disaster, we may spend a year or 2 recovering our strength. If we can hold out until the 18 tribes exhausts their resources, we can restore our access to violet gold at the northern border. When that time comes, I refuse to believe we'll be powerless against these western curs. But the court was presently shrouded in a miasma of corruption, and every step forward required arduous effort. Thousands of refugees remained homeless and destitute. Like this, how could the nation recover its strength and present a united front to its enemies? Xu Ling inhaled sharply, and the rims of his eyes grew red. He caught up to Prince Yan and said in an urgent undertone, Your Highness, are you aware? The reforms you pushed for in court caused too great a stir, and many consider you a thorn in their sides. If nothing else, just take this investigation in the south. That Yang Zhonghui, if he's truly been lying in his reports, he must also have an ear to the ground. He'll have heard news of your intentions these last few days. If he gets desperate, he might exchange all the silver, gold, and treasures in his estate for war beacon tickets and claim you went to extremes to push your pet policies and force local officials to meet all sorts of unachievable quotas. They could claim they had no choice but to shirk the law, and once the winds of change begin to blow, the Department of Supervision and Imperial Censorate will surely rise up and oppose you. What will you do then? A faint smile appeared on Chang'an's face. If it leads to someone taking responsibility for this mess of the situation, recovering Jiangnan, and bringing peace to the land, so what if I have to pack my bags? Commissioner Xu, none of what I've done is for myself, nor do I hope to gain a single accolade from those people. If someone wants to impeach me, they may do so. My conscience is clear. Whether I'm sleeping in the Grand Council or the Imperial dungeons, none of my ancestors will be appearing to slap me across the face in the middle of the night. As for the rest, he did not continue. A sneer seemed to flash across his young and handsome face. Catching a glimpse of the lonely fury and helplessness that hung heavy over Prince Yan, Xu Ling's heart thumped, and his face stung like fire. The prince had slapped the Imperial Censorate's face in full view of the court on more than one occasion, and the department's members all itched to dig up some dirt on the prince and beat his faction down until every one of them sported giant bumps on their heads. Meanwhile, the Department of Supervision was the gathering place of the purists within the court, those who, like Xu Ling, were willing neither to cling to powerful nobles nor roll around in the muck with copper-stinking merchants. They took pride in their loyalty to sovereign alone and viewed Prince Yan's exploits as akin to quenching a short-term thirst with long-term poison. Add in the insidious effects of the rumors flying about the court, And it was little surprise they found Prince Yan a shrewd and treacherous official who had the emperor in the palm of his hand. When Xu Ling agreed to come south with the prince, he had indeed intended to investigate and censure the corrupt officials of Jiangbei. But he had another, more important matter in his mind as well. While the established noble families and new upstarts were busy fighting like cats and dogs, the members of the Imperial Censorate and the Department of Supervision, who fancied themselves above corruption, had planned to join hands to impeach Prince Yan. Xuling's aims in joining this venture were not entirely pure. He was here both because the long-gone emperor wanted him to keep an eye on Prince Yan, and because these two departments sought evidence of Prince Yan's disloyal intent. And yet, even if his methods were a bit extreme, here was a man fretting and toiling over the ravaged state of Jiangnan and Jiangbei, while they in the court waited to pounce on the first mistake he made. Who, precisely, was bringing calamity upon the nation and its people? Shuling's voice choked on a sob. Your Highness. Chang'an raised an eyebrow in confusion. What is it, Commissioner Xu? For a moment, Shuling couldn't seem to speak. Guyuan walked wordlessly ahead of them, leading the way. That scholar Shuling thought he was so stealthily whispering into Chang'an's ear, but Marshal Gu's hearing was sharp when he wasn't deaf. He had heard every word from his position downwind of them. He cast a sidelong glance at his guards, who were furious listening to this conversation, then at Guchun's evasive expression. He was beginning to get a sense of how this accident that landed them behind enemy lines had occurred. Chapter 88. Wreaking Havoc. Guyuan lowered his head. After brief consideration, he understood for whose benefit Chang'an was making this trip south. On some level, Guyuan, who had grown up deep within the imperial palace, understood Li Feng better than Chang'an did. Any leader who had high aspirations but lacked in vision could easily end up in Li Feng's position. The long-gone emperor understood how to wield power well enough, but the most capable sheepdog could only herd sheep. Even if its teeth were sharp enough to slay a wolf in one-on-one battle, it could never become the Wolf King. This was the same idea. Guyuan didn't need to know the detailed lines of division within the court, nor what political opinions they held. Regardless of what Shuling's goals were in accompanying them, regardless of which sect or clan he belonged to, he was Li Feng's man to the last. Li Feng loved simple-minded people like this. Those who didn't curry favor, didn't form factions, and had no social standing or background. He spent his entire life searching for such pure officials. The question of what made an official pure aside, to the long-gone emperor, this designation held two layers of meaning. First, they were promoted by the emperor himself, had no noble families or powerful officials behind them, and had a sufficiently clean background. Second, they made the emperor feel safe and in control. This was, in fact, the path Prince Yan had initially taken. At the time, he had no foundation to speak of in the court, no support, no power, and no influence. All he had to his name were a few drops of imperial blood, and even then, it was in adulterated blood that gave others pause. When he shouldered the heavy responsibility of the Grand Council, seemingly fearless in his ignorance of the dangers that lay ahead, he was precisely what Li Feng would call a pure official. But later, Li Feng discovered that Prince Yan was no ignoramus. He was more than capable of stirring up waves. Alarmed by his manipulations, the emperor no longer believed in his purity. Thus, he had sent someone even purer to keep Prince Yan in check. An emperor was looking out through Commissioner Xu's bright, inquisitive eyes. Unfortunately, this long-distance field scope had a sincere nature. Prince Yan had yet to exhaust his tricks, but Xu Ling had already taken the bait hook, line, and sinker. There was no place for anyone truly upright and above flattery in the great Liang of today. Guyuan had tactfully avoided domestic affairs for years, but he knew too well what these people were like. Even far away at the borders of the nation, he had heard stories of Chang'an's deeds after entering the court. But hearing stories was one thing, and seeing it himself was another. Truth be told, up until this moment, Chang'e had still, in Gu Yuan's eyes, been that innocent and kind-hearted youth of years past. Talented, but never arrogant. Someone who had a bit of a temper, but didn't take it out on others without cause. And even when he did, he would stay well within the bounds of reason, and only act out to communicate to whomever had offended him that he was angry. The one on the receiving end of his ire would feel that they had been lightly scratched by the outstretched paw of some familiar little creature, leaving behind a white mark that failed to even break skin. Yet, it could still hurt someone down to the marrow. That youth had been warm and sincere, so sincere that, although Gu Yuan was logically aware that they were one and the same, on an emotional level, he'd been unable to connect that boy to the ruthless and resolute Prince Yan, Li Min. Today, under the battery of Jiangnan's wind and rain, these two unrelated individuals finally converged into one. Suddenly, both seemed unfamiliar. Gu Yuan had never quite caught his breath after his earlier spell, and his chest began to ache with the fury. But they were behind enemy lines. The commander-in-chief couldn't afford to wallow in sentiment. He had no choice but to maintain a reckless look of ease on his face and silently weather this emotional blow. Their party followed the Western captive to the closest sentry post with all speed. According to their captive, soldiers manning the sentry post split their patrols into two shifts. Patrolling the no man's land was easy, so, as time went on, these Western cavalrymen had begun to slack off. They were caught completely unawares when enemies snuck right up to them. "The hairy guy said the sentry post has just 2 suits of heavy armor," Xu Ling said quietly. "There's nothing else of use. Marshal, can heavy armor help us cross the river?" "Of course," Gu Yuan said. "It'll sink the instant it touches the water. Faster than an adulterer's cage. Perfect for all sorts of two-timing men and lewd women." Xu Ling was speechless. To think, for a moment there, he'd expected the Marquis of Anding to be serious. Looking back now, that was indeed a misapprehension. Gu Yuan wiped the fatigue off his face, feigning exuberance. "Don't get ahead of yourself. We'll use the foreign skins from this sentry post to sneak in among the frontline troops along the riverbank, then seize our chance to steal one of those speedy dragonettes. Commissioner Xu, don't worry. I've already notified old General Zhong. We'll have someone waiting for us on the other side once we reach the river." Xu Ling's eyes nearly popped out of his head. "Marshal Gu has already communicated with General Zhong? When?" "I'm psychic," said Gu Yuan in all seriousness. There he went again. Assistant Supervisory Commissioner Xu, who had walked into his trap time and again, finally learned to shut his mouth around Gu Yuan. He had an inkling now of how Prince Yan had achieved that steady nature of his that allowed him to remain pleasantly relaxed even when the sky was falling. Chang'e, however, twisted. He had already notified old General Zhong, but he had used the Lingyuan Pavilion's methods to do so. Xu Ling couldn't know of this, so he had prepared another show for the assistant envoy's benefit. Yet Gu Yuan had silently diverted suspicion from him with a few short words. The Black Iron Tiger Tally Gu Yuan held could deploy any military forces in the land during wartime. It wouldn't be strange if he had some unknown method of contacting the border garrisons. And no matter how dim one's wits, once Gu Yuan brushed off their inquiries, they ought to know not to probe further. With this, Xu Ling wouldn't find it suspicious when they encountered reinforcements. The rainwater dripping from Chang'e's palms was replaced with a layer of sweat. "He knows." Chang'e's heart lurched, then sank, ice cold. A person could plot, but success was up to the heavens. No matter how well laid the plan, deviations and mishaps were inevitable. As far as Chang'e was concerned, the first mishap was when, just as he was about to give the impassioned speech he had prepared to justify personally making the journey down south, Gu Yuan unexpectedly stepped forward and settled the whole affair with a word. An arrow knocked to the string had to be shot. It couldn't be aborted halfway. Chang'e had no choice but to steel himself and continue down this path, making his arrangements all the more secretive. When it came to Guyuan, the ever-prepared Prince Yan always found himself blundering. It wasn't because Chang'e didn't have the brains to plan around him, but because he couldn't quite figure out what his plans were in the first place. On the one hand, Chang'e wanted to conceal his plots from Guyuan just as he did from Xuling. Such underhanded maneuvers were dishonest, after all. Even if he had lowered himself to this level, he didn't want Guyuan to see the way he had engineered every last detail of their adventure. He didn't dare imagine what Guyuan would think of this. But on the other hand, he had a faint, self-destructive wish to see all his subterfuge fall apart before Guyuan. It was an urge much like throwing a meaningless tantrum with one's closest person. He wanted Guyuan to know exactly what kind of trash he was at his worst. Thus was the contradictory nature of his desires. He was afraid to touch Guyuan's hard bottom line, yet couldn't resist the urge to test him. The most mystifying thing in the world wasn't an enemy's treachery, but a lover's intentions. These, no matter how sincere, would always seem ever-changing in their target's eyes. Guyuan turned to look at him, seemingly by chance. Chang'e's lashes flickered involuntarily, as if he wanted to hide. Nevertheless, he met Guyuan's eyes and stared straight back, trying to dig up a single hint with the hooks in his gaze. Guchun chose that moment to tactlessly scoot over and say into Guyuan's ear, "Marshal, I suspect the hairy foreigner's heavy armor utilizes special tricks of engineering to burn less violet gold than ours. Why don't you go handle the soldiers while I take this heavy armor apart and steal some insights?" His popping up diverted Guyuan's gaze at exactly the right time. Chang'e couldn't read a thing from so brief a glance, and with all these obtrusive outsiders about, he couldn't just ask him to clear the air. Chang'e was left to fret in private. Guyuan selected a guard to accompany Guchun, and that was that. "If you don't manage to glean anything useful, I'll have to assume you're being lazy and serve you a court-martial when we get back. Let's go." On his command, 24 black crows silently surrounded the tiny western sentry post. They swiftly dealt with the few western soldiers inside who were still dreaming grand dreams in their beds, then dug up a map of the garrison's defenses and a few sets of light-pelt armor. Everyone donned a suit. As long as they kept their visors down, no one would be able to tell the people inside weren't the original owners. Guyuan pointed at their trembling western captive. "Put him in light armor and install a fuse in his gold tank. If he causes any trouble, blow him into dumpling filling. Oh, right. Where's Xiao Ge?" Guchun jogged up to him. "Aye, Marshal, here I am." In this brief period of time, Guchun had not only disassembled the foreigner's heavy armor, he'd taken the opportunity to pilfer their entire central propulsion system. Like a servant assigned to guard a household's treasury, he tied his spoils around his waist and refused to let them out of his hands, eyes gleaming like a rat that had fallen into the rice vat. He bounced over and said, "Marshal Gu, am I going to play a Western soldier too? I'm bringing this with me. Are there any sets of light armor that are a little larger around the stomach?" Guyuan looked him over with an unreadable expression, then directed his guards to truss Scholar Ge up like a chicken. He barked out a laugh. "What light armor? It's dozens of kilograms worth of weight. I have a much more suitable role for you where you won't need a costume at all. What do you think of playing the spy who crossed enemy lines to sniff around and got himself caught? If anyone interrogates us, we'll have a proper excuse. And look, with that thing, it seems like you got caught red-handed with stolen goods. Tie him up." Thus, Guchun replaced their western captive, a look of shock passing across his face. 2 steely-faced guards grabbed him and bound him with rope, then hung him from a pole by the wrists and ankles and carried him off, swaying along with their gait. Guchun wasn't an idiot. He guessed he must have offended the general somehow, and Guyuan was bullying him on purpose. He sent a plaintive look in the direction of Chang'e. You're what?" Guyuan lowered his visor. His voice sounded from beneath the icy-cold steel as if it were covered in a layer of frost. "Gag him. Captives aren't allowed to squeal and shout." Still on tenterhooks himself, Prince Yan was too afraid to speak up. So it was with his tacit permission that Scholar Good became a veritable human ball of injustice and was toted away on his pole. Their party marched toward the Westerners' garrison with their captive in tow. They finished crossing the wide stretch of no man's land and reached the enemy lines as dawn approached. By now, they could see through their field scopes that frightening western sea monster sprawled out across the surface of the river, as well as the western dragons boldly surging through the water, swift as tiger sharks cutting through the waves. For some of their party, this was their first time seeing these whirlwind, fast western dragons. Shu Ling got rather dizzy trying to track them with his eyes. The Westerners' defenses were too tight. His palms were covered in cold sweat. He couldn't fathom how Prince Yan and Gu Yuan had the guts to swagger about behind enemy lines. They were still some ways out from the garrison when the dark, cavernous mouths of several short cannons swiveled in their direction. Shu Ling swallowed with difficulty. He felt a hand on his shoulder and heard Prince Yan's voice in his ear. "When you're afraid, don't think about how we'll be dead meat if someone discovers us. Think about how these are all people we're going to exact revenge on in the future. Even if we don't take care of them today, we'll settle our accounts one by one tomorrow. We're here to kill, not be killed." Shu Ling heard a hunter's bloodlust beneath Prince Yan's placid tones. A shiver ran down his body. Then, as if that bloodlust had been transferred to him with the shiver, Shu Ling sucked in a deep breath and recalled the piles of white bones in the ancestral temple. He squeezed his eyes shut, finding that his fear had indeed faded. "Keep a tight hold on your guide's fuse," Prince Yan continued. "None of us understand their foreign language, so we'll have to rely on Commissioner Shu. If he makes any suspicious moves, Commissioner Shu, are you willing to take a life?" Assistant Supervisory Commissioner Shu had been a scholar since youth. He'd never slaughtered so much as a chicken. His hand holding the fuse shook. This was nothing to Shu Ling, but sensing his life hanging by a thread, the Western captive began to tremble as well. The hand on Shu Ling's shoulder pressed down like an iron clamp even through the steel armor, and its influence settled Shu Ling's nerves. He gritted his teeth. "I am. Don't worry, Your Highness. I won't let you down." Chang'eng slowly released him, sensing Gu Yuan's gaze. He hid behind his visor, afraid to return it. He discreetly wiped a layer of sweat from his palms. He could tell every person what they ought to do, but there was no one for him to look to for advice. The Western sentry shouted something through a copper squall like an inquiry about their presence. Shu Ling cleared his throat and yelled back, "We caught a spy from the Central Plains while on patrol. We brought him here to ask what to do with him." The garrison guard poked out his head and gave them a suspicious look. Gu Yuan covertly tapped the Western captive's back with the hilt of his borrowed sword. "Do your job." Shu Ling didn't have to translate. The man understood Gu Yuan's meaning well enough. He flipped up the visor on his light armor with trembling hands, and the familiar tuft of blonde hair allayed the guard's suspicions. The man then examined Gucheng, hanging from his pole, and bared his teeth in a sneer. With a wave of his hand, the cannon muzzle slowly swiveled away, and the garrison opened its gates for them. "Wait here," said the guard who let them inside. "His Holiness is entertaining an important guest, and the senior officers are all with him. Even if you make a report, there's no one who can do anything about it. Go register yourselves and lock up this pig. We'll roast it later tonight." No one else could understand a word of this, so none of their party reacted. Shu Ling knew that right now, even Prince Yan couldn't help him. He hastily gulped and calmed himself as much as he could. "Guests from where?" "The Holy Empire." The guard impatiently scratched at his face. "Don't ask about things that aren't your business. Who knows when they'll let us go home? This war is never going to end. Hey, brother, these useless layabouts from the no man's land caught a spy. Give them a few bites of meat jerky. This is probably the greatest achievement of our lives." The Western soldiers laughed. Shu Ling's stuttering heart settled back into a steady rhythm. He led the way, shoving their Western captive in the direction the guard had indicated. At that moment, the captive jerked to the side, exposing the fuse in Shuling's hand. The guard, who had yet to leave, saw it at once. "Wait, what's that on your back?" Shuling was immediately soaked in a cold sweat. Now suspicious, the guard strode up to Shuling and looked him up and down. His head shot to the sword at his waist. "Lift your visor." Shuling's heart pounded in his chest. He froze. Just then, a shrill cry of an alarm sounded in the distance. The wind swept a burst of flame high into the sky, and countless Western soldiers sprinted past them. While the Western sentry was distracted, Changang stepped forward. A thin needle the length of a man's arm had at some point appeared in his hand, and he jabbed it into the guard's neck like a flash of lightning. The Western sentry didn't make a sound as he died on his feet. A guard from the Black Iron Battalion plucked off the man's helmet. He cut the rope binding Guchon and plucked the helmet onto his head. When Shuling finally caught his breath, he noticed one of Guyuan's guards was missing. Guyuan smoothly snatched the fuse from Shuling's hand and strode off with a "let's go." Before Shuling could react, Guyuan had yanked on the fuse on the captive's back. He flicked something open on the back of the man's light armor with his wind slasher and kicked him away. A great white cloud billowed from the captive's back, and Guyuan's kick sent him flying forward, trailing steam behind him. The man let out an inhuman shriek. At the same time, the garrison soldiers inevitably looked toward the source of the noise. On a signal from Guyuan, the well-trained Black Iron Battalion guards raised their bows and cannons and unleashed a wave of fire in all directions. The Western captive's light armor exploded, the force of the blast sending nearby tents and Western soldiers flying. Shuling lost his footing, but an armored hand caught him and dragged him into a stumbling run. They fled in the chaos. Rounding a corner, Guyuan threw out an arm to halt Shuling and Changang, who was still dragging the assistant envoy. "How do you say they went that way after them?" he asked, low and quick. Shuling translated it into the Western's language before he could give it any conscious thought. He finished speaking just as the enemy soldiers overtook them. Guyuan drew the sword that came with the Western light armor. He opened his mouth and perfectly mimicked the words Shuling had just taught him, then ran ahead, sword in hand, to personally lead the charge with great vigor. The soldiers were in identical armor and identical visors. It was impossible to tell who was who. After leading the Black Iron Battalion for so many years, Guyuan had developed an imperious general's disposition. The Western soldiers couldn't resist running after him at his command. Shuling was speechless. Those who had been the pursued mysteriously became the pursuers. They ran all the way to the riverbank before Shuling saw a dark silhouette peel itself from the crowd in the distance. The man had already removed the Western armor he was using as a disguise, revealing himself to be Guyuan's missing guard. The Black Iron Battalion soldier let out a piercing whistle, then leapt into the river. Struck by inspiration mid-crisis, Shuling yelled in the Westerner's foreign language, "To the ships! After him!" Guyuan hadn't expected Commissioner Shu to be corrupted so quickly. Guyuan unceremoniously hoisted Shuling with his several dozen kilograms of light armor and tossed him down from the riverbank onto the Western dragon. A few sailors on the dragon had heard the racket on land and hurried over, only to see several dark silhouettes land in quick succession on their vessel. With the rise and fall of their blades, they mopped up the Western sailors, striking each man down in a single fatal blow without one sloppy move or sound. Before the bodies could fall, their killers deftly supported them so it looked as if they were walking into the cabin side by side. Shortly thereafter, with the mayhem on the bank still in full swing, a Western dragon slipped out of the garrison's harbor and into the darkness of early dawn. All right, you guys, so there we have it, chapters 87 through 88, and I have to say, I actually enjoyed these. It's very interesting just to see like the inner workings of Emperor Li Feng's mind as far as, his intentions behind sending Shuling, but then even Shuling's own thoughts as far as watching Changang on their little journey. Something else that I wanted to talk about that was just said in the book that I've always applied to my personal life is going to be on page 365. When Changung basically realizes that Gu Yuan is in on his inner workings, basically, and his plans. And he has this kind of thing where he's like, I want him to know, but at the same time, I don't want him to know. Like, I want him to know my deepest, darkest things to see how wretched I am, but I don't. Or I really just like the way it was worded. He was afraid to touch Gu Yuan's hard bottom line, yet couldn't resist the urge to test him. The most mystifying thing in the world wasn't an enemy's treachery, but a lover's intentions. And just starting with that first sentence about, basically your significant other knowing the deepest, darkest parts of yourself. There was a point in time, which it may still be, I don't know, that I was considering becoming a marriage coach. I've been married now for almost 9 years. And one of the things that I had shared with my followers on social media was to trust your partner with the darkest parts of yourself. And I was speaking from personal experience of, fear, kind of like Changung, but it's like when you are truly married to the right person, and it could be before marriage as well, but there are going to be certain things about yourself that you may feel utterly terrified to reveal to them. And it's kind of like, I totally get it. But if you've truly married the right person, they will still love you no matter what. And then some things that you may think are actually super dark may not even be that bad to them. They may be so understanding. They may have possibly gone through the same thing too. Or they may even be thinking the same way. You just never know. And then, of course, if you're with the wrong person, well, you'll find out, and better late than never, right? But yeah, I just love telling people, go about it the right way and at the right time and stuff, but trust your partner with the darkest parts of yourself, because chances are they are going to be that light that you need so that you don't just feel like you're completely wretched or reckless or, worthless, whatever it is you might be thinking. And so I really loved seeing that here, and watching a tiny sliver of that come to surface. And then the second line, when it says the most mystifying thing in the world isn't an enemy's treachery, but, a lover's intentions. Absolutely true. Because at the end of the day, even if you don't know what the enemy's plans are, you know they're your enemy. But it's much more scary when you are facing potential judgment of those that you love, those that you care about. So I'm definitely feeling Changung on this one. Anyway, I will see you all next time. I promise. The final 2 chapters will be read in this book, and then we'll be on to volume 4. So this is very exciting. Just to kind of give you guys a little update, my school classes are becoming a little bit more rigorous, and I'm working a bit more now. So my releases may not be either as often or as long. So a lot of times my videos, depending on like the arc sizes, can be anywhere, from like an hour and 20 minutes to almost 2 hours long. And sometimes I release one for 2 days and then I break a day or something like that. I don't have like a set specific schedule. The only thing is I try to always release at 10:30 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. But with things becoming a little bit more rigorous, I'm not really sure how the ebb and flow of things are going to go. So I might be releasing shorter videos, but I'm not going to stop things. So, sometimes it might be, okay, I can only read 2 chapters or maybe 3 chapters, depending on the length of them. But I just wanted to give you guys a little head up. I'm doing my best, but I'm doing what I can while still taking care of myself and doing my other hobbies and making sure I commit to my psychology degree and my job, especially since I love my job. So anyway, aside from loving my job and my hobbies, I Neiman, love you guys. Bye-bye.